It was September 19th, 1999, and 48-year-old Susan Fassett just knew in her bones that her own personal day of reckoning was coming. As soon as Susan stepped out of church that morning and away from the tight knot of friends all busy saying goodbye to each other, the too bright smile on her face was instantly replaced by the lines of strain and worry that seemed to get deeper every time she looked in the mirror. There was just no getting around it. Over the last 4 years, Susan had made a terrible mess of her life, and now she and her husband of 24 years would have to pay for their mistakes. The day was coming, or maybe it was already here, when she and Jeff would have to look, together and deeply, into the neglected and now poisoned core of their 24-year-long marriage. As Susan walked, pulled out her car keys, and headed towards her brand new gold Jeep Cherokee, she barely noticed the bright sun glowing through the leaves of the maple and oak trees in the woods beyond the parking lot. When she and Jeff had first moved to the tiny town of Pleasant Valley with its 9,000 residents, Susan had thought it was one of the most beautiful places on earth. And it was, with its rolling hills and acres of cornfields stitched with old colonial-style homes set on nice big lots. Pleasant Valley was one of those places that actually lived up to its name. And for Susan and Jeff, the location was perfect. They could live and raise their family in a safe, quiet, affluent community where everyone knew and watched out for one another. And the city where they both worked, the town of Poughkeepsie, 10 miles to the north, was just a 20-minute commute away. But now, Pleasant Valley, like everything else in Susan's life, felt tainted and claustrophobic, like these beautiful walls were slowly closing in on her. Climbing into her car, Susan's shoulders slumped. The problems in her marriage had probably started a long time ago. Her job as a personnel director at Poughkeepsie Town Hall and Jeff's grueling overnight shift as a lieutenant with the Poughkeepsie Police Department had left them with so little time for one another. And now that their oldest son, Jason, was 20, and their younger son, Christopher, was 17, Susan and Jeff were no longer bound together by all these shared responsibilities of the children's school and sports and social activities. But in the last 5 years, something much worse than two people drifting apart had also happened. Because for Susan, her work, or at least the person she had met through her work, had also led her to break the wedding vows she had made so happily 24 years earlier when she promised to be faithful to her husband no matter what. Even now, after so many years that the affair felt almost as normal as her marriage, when Susan actually thought about what she was doing, she still felt shocked that these were the choices she had made. And when she said it all out loud to herself, "I am cheating on my husband, I am having an affair, Jeff does not deserve this," she knew absolutely that what she was doing was wrong. And yet, she had not stopped. She meant to stop. Every day she meant to stop. But armed with that good intention, telling herself that every meeting and every call with her lover would definitely be the last, the affair had just dragged on. And over time, Susan had told herself that the excitement and attention she got from outside her marriage actually made it possible for her to stay in her marriage. It somehow made up for the lack of emotional connection she felt she had with Jeff, and the fact that she and Jeff worked opposite schedules. She worked days, he worked nights, although that too was Susan's fault. But now, word had gotten around Poughkeepsie Town Hall that Susan was stepping out on Jeff, and worst of all, Jeff himself had recently confronted her affair partner, and despite her lover's denials, and Susan's own denials, her pretend outrage had sounded false and hollow, even to her. Just 10 minutes after driving out of the parking lot of the Pleasant Valley United Methodist Church, Susan had arrived home. As she turned away from her car and started walking through the thick carpet of fallen leaves, she noted how the outside of the cranberry red house that she shared with Jeff looked as neglected and in need of maintenance as their own marriage. A moment later, standing at the front door, Susan steeled herself, arranging her features into an expression that appeared refreshed and relaxed, the way she wanted to feel after going to church. Then she opened the door, put down her coat and purse in the hallway, and then stepped into the living room to say what would sound like a cheery hello to Jeff. But instantly, before they had even exchanged a single word, Susan could feel the tension that hung between them, and even without seeing his face, she could sense Jeff's hurt and distrust. And lately, there had been something else in Jeff's expression too. Something hard and knowing in how Jeff looked at her, the way he turned away from her in mild disgust. Just for a moment, as Susan hovered on the threshold of the room where her husband sat waiting for her, Susan wondered how other people in Pleasant Valley saw her. She knew that from the outside at least, she seemed like the last person who would be having an affair, let alone an affair that had grown as complicated as this one had somehow become. To friends and family, Susan was the quintessential mom, wife, and working woman. She was a college-educated professional who was up early in the morning and busy most nights until she went to bed. An attractive woman with curly white blonde hair, oversized glasses, a tiny but somehow appealing overbite, and a solid build, Susan mostly stood out as someone who was always willing to help other people, whether it was through her various community and church activities or in response to a direct request, even if that request came from a total stranger. In fact, except for her height, Susan was over 6 feet tall, Susan knew there was nothing about her that seemed at all out of the ordinary. At work, she was competent, well-liked, and respected, and outside of work, her daily routines seemed as transparent and predictable as her ready smile and generally upbeat attitude. On Monday nights, she attended a jazzercise class at Pleasant Valley's Jewish Community Center. On Thursday evenings, Susan attended choir practice, and on Sundays, she attended church service and helped fill the worship space with the music she loved. If Susan had any guilty pleasures at all, it was probably her devotion to the daily TV soap opera Days of Our Lives, a melodrama that she made sure to record so she could watch it every night after all her chores were done. And as soon as she hit play, she could lose herself in the stories of beautiful people whose relationships, friendships, families, marriages, and work lives were in a constant state of turmoil, like her own had so recently and secretly become. Even at home, Jeff was the only person who seemed to have any inkling of Susan's affair. Her sons, Jason and Christopher, both knew her as a loving mom who was easy to talk with and confide in, that unusual person who would listen rather than pass judgment. And Susan knew that all those traits that made her approachable and kind seemed to have been handed down to her directly from her own mother, or maybe just learned from both her parents ever since she was a child growing up on a farm 30 miles to the south in the rural town of Pauling. Susan's father, a farmer, and Susan's mother, a schoolteacher, had met in church, and while their first house had just 4 rooms, Susan and her only other sibling, a sister who was 7 years older than Susan, had always enjoyed the love and attention of their parents. And after Susan's older sister had left the farm to go to nursing school and later to settle in Connecticut, Susan also started dreaming of bigger and better things, of becoming a teacher 30 miles and a world away in the big city of nearby Poughkeepsie, population 30,000. So, after graduating from college, Susan had packed her bags, and armed with her ambitions, she had left home and headed south. But instead of becoming a teacher, she landed a job in Poughkeepsie Town Hall, where eventually, as personnel director, she would be responsible for all the activities related to hiring city employees and working out their job descriptions and benefits. And it wasn't long after her arrival in Poughkeepsie that Susan had met her future husband, Jeff Fassett, at a local bar. Like Susan, Jeff was also starting his professional career. Jeff had been born in Poughkeepsie, and after attending military college in Pennsylvania, he had returned to his hometown and joined the Poughkeepsie Police Department. A quiet, generous, and dependable man with a quick laugh, Jeff had immediately been drawn to Susan's bubbly personality, sparkling blue eyes, and a playful streak that made her fun to be around. And when Jeff and Susan, so tall in her wedding dress and heels that she could look squarely into Jeff's eyes, promised to, quote, hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until parted by death, end quote, she had meant every word of those vows. But by late afternoon on that bright Sunday, those early days of her marriage seemed so remote, Susan wondered if they had ever existed at all. Still, when she again walked into the living room, this time to ask Jeff what he would like for dinner, the finality of his simple, harsh statement to her came as a shock. Jeff looked up at Susan. "You're busted," he told her in a quiet voice. Then he turned away before saying, "Go, get out." Susan's smile slipped from her face, but before she could offer any excuses or explanations, Jeff told her that he didn't need her confession to know that she'd been having an affair. He was a cop after all. He'd seen the signs and had his suspicions now for months, maybe even years, but until now he'd never confronted her, and he'd never looked for proof. In fact, he had hoped that if Susan was cheating, she'd get it out of her system and come back to him, and they'd never even have to talk about it. But when that didn't happen, and the rumors at town hall were too loud and persistent to ignore, Jeff had recently attached a recording device to the Facets' home telephone, and sure enough, he'd heard a phone call his wife had made that left no doubt in his mind that she was not just having sex with someone else, but his wife was deeply involved with someone else. For the time being, get out meant that Susan would take what she needed for the next several days from their master bedroom and move into the small apartment once intended for Jeff's elderly mother that Jeff had built in a separate part of the house. That night, Susan lay awake in the narrow, empty bed. As she stared up at the ceiling, she thought about her life with Jeff, about all that they had done and made together, about their 2 children, and about the pleasure that both of them used to feel when they were together. It was as though someone had pulled a blindfold off of her eyes. There was suddenly no question in Susan's mind that even though her marriage was horribly damaged as a result of things she herself had done, it was worth infinitely more to her than continuing her affair. As she laid there, she wondered if there was still hope for her and Jeff. And at around midnight, as the clock clicked over to September 20th, 1999, the 24th anniversary of their marriage, Susan turned on the bedside light, then swung her long legs over the edge of the bed and stood up. Slipping on her glasses and pulling her robe tightly around her, Susan stepped to the bag she had packed that afternoon and began rummaging through her belongings. When she found the things she was looking for, she held both items tightly in her hands for a second or two before sliding them into her pocket. Straightening up, she took a deep breath, then left the little apartment and made her way to the bedroom she had so recently shared with Jeff. Once inside, she stood next to the bed and looked at her husband. "Jeff," she whispered, waking him up from a light and troubled sleep. "Would you consider reconciling?" she asked him. And then Susan reached into her pocket and took out the items she had grabbed a few minutes earlier, a cell phone and a pager she had been using to contact her lover. "Here," Susan told Jeff, handing him the 2 devices. "No more," Susan said. "I promise, it's over." A few days later, the Facets' older son, Jason, walked into their house and saw his mom and dad cuddling together on the couch. He'd known that his parents were considering the possibility of splitting up, so he was visibly surprised. When his parents noticed the strange look on his face, Jeff and Susan smiled. "We decided to stay together and try to work things out," Susan told their son. And over the next month, starting with Susan and Jeff both taking a week off work and spending every minute together, it seemed to the Facets' sons that their parents had in fact fallen back in love. Jeff and Susan had even decided to buy new wedding bands and renew their marriage vows, and both Jeff and Susan had started working together on some badly needed home improvement projects that they had been putting off for years. On Thursday, October 28th, about 5 weeks after Jeff and Susan had made the decision to reconcile, Jeff stopped by his wife's office in Poughkeepsie Town Hall. He had just picked up his new wedding band, and he wanted to show Susan how it looked. Smiling up at Jeff, Susan touched her finger to the bright, unscratched gold and agreed that the new band was perfect. Then she told her husband she'd try to be home a little early that evening so they could have a family dinner together with Jason and Christopher and the boys' girlfriends before Susan had to leave for her 7 p.m. choir practice. Throughout dinner that evening, Jeff kept stealing glances at the new gold band on his ring finger. To him, Susan's breaded chicken and green beans had never tasted so good. Now that the 2 of them had talked things out, everything about his life, from simple meals to putting on his uniform each night and heading to work in the dark, seemed a million times better. Before leaving the house for choir practice, Susan smiled as Jeff gave her a kiss and thanked her for preparing dinner. He told her he'd look forward to seeing her when she got back. Then Susan stepped outside and walked to her car. Climbing inside the Jeep, she made the short drive from her home to the big white Methodist church located at 99 Martin Road. As Susan expected, the small lot next to the church was full. After all, with Thanksgiving and Christmas fast approaching, this was a season of music when every member of the choir showed up for their 90-minute practice. But after parking in the second lot across the street, Susan did not immediately get out of her car and head across Martin Street for the church. Instead, she sat for a moment inside the quiet Jeep and thought about the pager that she had not given to Jeff back on the night of October 19th when he had confronted her about her affair. Now, as she looked up at the simple white steeple and cross lit by the church floodlights, she considered the 5 calls she had made to her lover earlier that day. And all at once, Susan could feel her chest tighten with fear. She knew that there was just so much that any husband could forgive, and there were still things Jeff didn't know, things she could not let him know, things that made it very hard for Susan to do what she absolutely needed to do: end this affair. She thought back to the incident that had happened just as she and her family were finishing dinner that night. Jeff had glanced out the window and thought he had seen someone skulking in the shadows of the driveway. His cop senses always on high alert, he'd stepped out onto the back porch for a closer look, but whoever it was, if in fact there had been anyone there at all, had melted away into the darkness. Susan gave a tiny shake and told herself to stop being ridiculous. Her lover had not been happy when she told him she wanted to end the affair, and he had demanded one more recent sexual encounter. But that was done now, and she wanted to believe that they had parted on good terms and that her lover would not do anything to hurt her or her family. And so, if there really had been a person in the driveway, Susan told herself that it was probably just someone who had gotten lost, and maybe they were thinking about asking for directions but thought better of it. And with that, Susan gathered her purse and coat, left the Jeep locked in the parking lot, and headed to the Pleasant Valley United Methodist Church. An hour and a half later, at 8:36 p.m., Susan was stepping out of the church surrounded by friends, all of them chatting as they groped in pockets and purses for car keys before fanning out in different directions as they headed for the two different parking lots. For just 90 minutes, in the joy of singing, Susan had been able to forget all of her worries and guilt. And now, as she said goodbye to other choir members and made the short walk across Martin Street to her gold Jeep, parked under an overhead light in the far lot, Susan felt a rare sense of inner peace. Humming a few bars of music from the new arrangement the choir would sing this coming Sunday, Susan failed to notice that a car she didn't recognize was parked right alongside her own in the church lot. It certainly did not belong to any of the members of church choir, whose cars had become as familiar as the sound of each member's voice. Instead, without so much as a glance at the car or the person who sat inside, Susan stepped to the driver's side of her Jeep, unlocked the door, and climbed behind the wheel. Closing the car door, Susan put the key in the ignition, turned on the car and headlights, then reached up to her left to pull the seatbelt down across her lap. A moment later, the cold, clear night outside the Pleasant Valley United Methodist Church was shattered by the sound of 6 gunshots, and then the kick of gravel as the car that had been parked next to Susan's peeled out of the church lot and was almost immediately swallowed up by the thin ribbon of traffic along Route 72 out of town. Within moments of the shots, members of the church choir were either pulling out their cell phones or darting back into the church to call 911. At the same time, a few others headed for the far lot where the gunshots had come from, and where at least one person saw an older model light-colored station wagon speeding to the parking lot exit. By the time the first ambulance had arrived at the United Methodist Church, one of Susan's friends was sitting hunched over on the ground next to Susan's car, their arms cradling Susan's head and shoulders. When the first bullet had shattered the driver's side window of the gold Jeep Cherokee, Susan, her seatbelt not yet securely fastened, must have reached instinctively for her car door so she could jump down and try to escape the attack. Instead, when the door opened, Susan had tumbled out, and by the time her friend had reached her, Susan was slumped against the side of her car, her neck dark with blood, but still alive. Even as the ambulance carrying Susan had raced off to St. Francis Hospital in Poughkeepsie, the lead detective in the case was already on his way to the crime scene. Arthur Boyko, a lieutenant with the New York State Police, had been notified of a shooting and possible dead body at the United Methodist Church parking lot in Pleasant Valley. Detective Boyko knew exactly where that church was located. Assigned to the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, he worked with Troop K in a barracks located at the edge of Pleasant Valley, fewer than 5 miles from the church. By the time Detective Boyko arrived at the church, local police had secured the scene with yellow crime scene tape and were doing their best to keep potential witnesses separate from the growing crowd of onlookers. Tall, lean, and commanding with his thin face and military-style haircut, the 34-year-old detective immediately took charge of the situation. And right away, he knew that this investigation would be very, very complicated. Because in the same breath that choir members gave first responders the name of the victim, Susan Fassett, they also told officers that Susan's husband was a cop, a lieutenant with the Poughkeepsie Police Department. Even before forming any first impressions of the crime scene, investigator Boyko knew that most murders and attempted homicides are committed by people close to the victim. And that made Jeff Fassett an immediate person of interest, especially since, as a police officer, Jeff had a gun, a service weapon that had to be secured and tested as soon as possible. At the same time, the detective also needed to make sure that Jeff and his sons were informed of the attack on Susan. And if Susan was still alive, her family deserved the chance to visit her right away at the hospital. The decision about whether to question Jeff as a suspect or just inform him of the attack on Susan and let him go see her was made for the investigator when one of the witnesses to the shooting said that the car that had been parked next to Susan's belonged to Jeff Fassett. Operating on the assumption that Jeff was armed and dangerous and may even try to harm other family members who might be inside the house with him, police immediately organized a Special Weapons and Tactics Team, or SWAT team, to surround the Fassett house and take Jeff and anyone else inside the house into police custody. Meanwhile, back at the crime scene, Detective Boyko had assigned officers to carry out interviews with eyewitnesses, along with Susan's friends, neighbors, and co-workers at Poughkeepsie Town Hall. In making a close survey of the scene and hearing initial eyewitness accounts, the detective had also arrived at several important conclusions. As crime scene techs collected and photographed evidence and dusted for fingerprints, Detective Boyko had decided that this was not some random attack or attempted robbery. No one had taken Susan's personal belongings, including her purse, which were still in plain sight on the front passenger seat, and whoever had attacked Susan must have been lying in wait for her, which suggested that not only was Susan the specific target of the attack, but that her would-be killer knew something about Susan's routines and expected that Susan would be at that church that night for choir practice. But the pattern of gunfire also made it unlikely that this was an execution-style hit. Not only did Susan seem like a very unlikely target for that, first responders had also reported that none of the bullets were clustered around Susan's head like you would expect in an execution-style hit. Instead, her attacker had fired a spray of bullets, including one that had missed its mark completely and instead lodged in the doorframe of Susan's car. By the time police had Jeff, his two sons, and their girlfriends lying face down and handcuffed on the gravel driveway outside of the Fassett home, it was 11 p.m. and Susan had already died of her injuries. And for the next 16 hours, police interrogated Jeff about his wife's murder, even as his sons sat handcuffed to separate desks inside the local police station. All Jeff and the boys had been able to find out during a tense 2-hour standoff with the SWAT team that had surrounded their house was that Susan had been shot at the United Methodist Church. Although Jeff declared his innocence and answered every question in a calm, neutral voice, he had been a cop long enough to know that things looked very bad for him. While Susan was at choir practice, he had left his house and driven to Poughkeepsie to get his paycheck. So not only had an eyewitness ID'd Jeff's car as the one leaving the scene of the crime, Jeff also had no alibi for the time of the murder. And police had discovered that Jeff had a very strong motive for this murder. If Susan thought she had kept her affair a secret from those around her, she was mistaken. In no time, neighbors and co-workers had reported to police that Susan Fassett was having an affair. Not only that, but as Jeff told police, just weeks earlier, he had confronted Susan's affair partner with his suspicions right in the middle of Jeff's office inside the Poughkeepsie Police Department. But throughout that long night of questioning, Jeff never wavered from his absolute insistence that he had nothing to do with his wife's brutal murder. And he also never wavered from telling police that if they wanted to find his wife's killer, they should go talk with the man she'd been seeing outside of their marriage. "You can turn on the hot lights," Jeff told the lie detector expert from the State Bureau of Criminal Investigation. "Beat me with rubber hoses. But when you're all done with me and you get me out of the way, you go see Fred Andros. He did this. He's involved in this." The identity of Susan's affair partner and his possible involvement in her murder sent shockwaves through every level of the investigation, even making its way into the regional offices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. It also sent shockwaves through Poughkeepsie Town Hall, where Fred Andrus had worked, until recently, as the head of the town's water department. Because Fred Andrus's name was already widely and publicly linked to serious criminal activity. Back in May of 1999, just 5 months before Susan's murder, Fred had been forced to resign his job as water superintendent after he was caught collecting bribes for a man named William Paroli. the most powerful political operative in the Poughkeepsie Republican Party. And one day after Fred resigned, he pled guilty to corruption charges and struck a deal with the FBI. In exchange for a lesser sentence, Fred had agreed to testify against William Paroli, who was charged with running a widespread shakedown operation of local contractors for the previous 6 years. And not only was Fred Andrus a known thief and liar, he was also a well-known womanizer. Despite his bullet-shaped head, small facial features, and Elvis-like pompadour all stacked on top of his 5'7" overweight body, Fred was on his 4th marriage, a fact that did not stop him from regularly soliciting the services of Poughkeepsie area prostitutes. The connection between Fred and Susan, confirmed by Jeff, opened the door to all kinds of new leads in the investigation. If it wasn't Jeff who killed his wife in a jealous rage, was it Fred? Was it Fred's wife? If Fred was involved with multiple women, could one of them have viewed Susan as a rival and decided to kill her? Or did Susan, because of her close association with Fred, know something about the ongoing corruption probe that made her a target of assassination? By 4 a.m. on the morning of October 29th, while Jeff was still being questioned at the Pleasant Valley Police Station, Investigator Boyko was sitting across the table from Fred inside Fred's comfortable 3-story home located in a nice part of Poughkeepsie called Hyde Park. And within minutes of talking to Fred, the detective was aware that Fred, despite his less-than-handsome appearance, possessed a certain charm and confidence. He also had an airtight alibi for the evening of Susan's murder. From 7 to 9 p.m. the previous night, Fred and his wife had spent the evening with friends, a retired Poughkeepsie police officer and his wife. The men had spent most of the evening down in Fred's basement, building very sophisticated model airplanes, which was a hobby the two friends shared. As for his relationship with Susan, Fred would confirm that he had been having a 4-year-long affair with Susan, and that they had actually known each other for 16 years before that. Fred also confirmed that Susan had wanted to end their affair after her confrontation with her husband Jeff back in mid-September, but Fred insisted that it had been a mutual decision to end the affair. And when the two of them had broken it off back in September, Fred had made a full confession to his own wife, who had been generous enough to forgive him. When asked when he had last seen or had a sexual encounter with Susan, Fred disclosed that he was actually impotent and that the physical part of his relationship with Susan consisted of cuddling and kissing and companionship. According to Fred, the last time he and Susan had actually had sexual intercourse was 1.5 years ago. Although Fred was obviously distressed by the news that Susan was dead, the only subject that seemed to make the disgraced town official nervous was whether the murder could have anything to do with the ongoing corruption probe at Poughkeepsie Town Hall. Fred admitted that now that he was a witness for the FBI, he felt like he could be in danger from local bad guys. And Fred also admitted that it was possible Susan could have been in danger just because of him. Contrary to what Detective Boyko heard, that Susan's affair with Fred seemed to be public knowledge, Fred insisted that he and Susan had kept their relationship a very closely guarded secret. It seemed like a small discrepancy, but one that the investigator knew he would have to follow up on. Meanwhile, detectives also began to collect all of the communication data, telephone, pager, cell phone, and email that belonged to the key figures in the case, including Susan, Fred, and Jeff. With the help of technology experts, investigators hoped to compile a picture of who was where and who was talking to whom in the days and weeks leading up to Susan's murder. The first break in the case came on October 30th, 2 days after Susan's murder. Partial results from Susan's autopsy had revealed traces of semen inside of Susan, meaning she must have had intercourse between 24 and 48 hours before she had died. Hours later, Jeff was brought back to the police station, where he told detectives that the last time he and Susan had made love was 4 or 5 days before she was killed. An analysis of the blood sample Jeff gave police, along with the results of a lie detector test he also agreed to take, confirmed Jeff's story. And after seeing pictures of Jeff's car, the woman who had placed his car in the church parking lot on the night of the murder also told police that she actually might have been mistaken. It might have been a different car. While police were still not willing to rule Jeff out as a suspect, they now knew that they had to find the man who had had sex with Susan within 2 days of her murder. Unfortunately, the problem with this new piece of physical evidence was that police simply had no other suspects aside from Jeff against whom they could match the semen sample. So, even though police had ruled Fred Andros out as the murderer, Detective Boyko decided it was still worth following up with him, as well as with Jeff, to see if either man could shed additional light on what was happening in Susan's life or in her past that might provide any clues to her murder. Because Fred had a solid alibi for the time of the murder, and police had no evidence that linked him to the crime, there was no legal way to compel Fred to give them a DNA sample so they could rule him out as the mystery man who last had sex with Susan Fassett. But when Fred declined the investigators' request for such a sample, there was nothing to prevent Investigator Boyko from inviting Fred to have lunch with him in a public place, and then for the detective to collect a DNA sample by pocketing the straw that Fred had used to sip from his cup of water. Besides, after hearing rumors that Fred regularly solicited sex from prostitutes, investigators had to wonder if Fred had been lying when he told them he was unable to have sex. But it wasn't until mid-December, 1.5 months after Susan was gunned down, that Detective Boyko and the Bureau of Criminal Investigation would get the tip they needed to break the murder case wide open. And the story that investigators ultimately pieced together would make Susan's favorite soap opera, Days of Our Lives, look like a happy fairy tale written for kids. Based on what investigators discovered, here is a reconstruction of what happened on the night of Thursday, October 28th, when Susan left the United Methodist Church in Pleasant Valley and hummed her way across the parking lot to her brand new gold Jeep Cherokee. As soon as the killer arrived at the church, they saw that their timing was perfect. Susan's distinctive Jeep was parked in the lot farther away from the church, and there were several empty slots on either side of the Jeep. A moment later, the killer had backed the old Taurus station wagon with the fake license plates into the empty space next to the Jeep. Now, the front passenger seat of the Taurus was directly across from the driver's side of the Jeep. As the killer hoisted their bulky frame from the driver's side into the passenger seat, they put the passenger side seat back all the way so anyone looking at the Taurus would think the car was empty. Reclining in the dark, the killer tried to slow their racing heart. Earlier that evening, the killer had actually gone directly to Susan's house to see if they could get a clean shot at her while she was eating dinner with her family, or if she stepped outside alone onto the back porch. But the killer had barely made it halfway up the driveway before Susan's husband had suddenly come out the back door and begun to make a slow circuit of the house while calling out if anyone was out there. That had been even worse than what had happened 4 days earlier, on Monday, October 25th, when the killer had driven to the Pleasant Valley Jewish Community Center, intending to kill Susan there, but the center had been too crowded and Susan's car wasn't there, so the killer had just left. But now there was no turning back. It had been made very clear to the killer that Susan was not dead by the end of tonight, that very bad things would happen to the killer's own family. Closing their eyes in the dark, the killer could see the photographs spread out on the kitchen table in front of them. The killer's son, each sibling, each aunt, each stepchild, all pictured alone, all vulnerable to some terrible accident, including murder. It would be a shame if anything happened to them, the person sitting across the table had said in that low monotone that had somehow always sounded so threatening and dangerous. The choice was clear: Susan or the killer's own loved ones. And at 4 p.m. that afternoon, the killer was driving away from their home in the Catskill Mountains, 1 hour south to Pleasant Valley. Along the way, the killer stopped at a local Kmart near the Fassett home and bought shoes, a t-shirt, a black full-face ski mask, and a bottle of pain pills for the headache that now never seemed to go away. A little further on, the killer pulled into a Dunkin' Donuts coffee shop and bought 24 donuts and then crammed them one after the other into their mouth. There had been an added incentive: get rid of Susan, and the killer would not have to pay back that loan, which now totaled over $10,000. Yes, the decision to go directly to Susan's house had been stupid, but there was no harm done. And now the killer was perfectly placed to make the kill and then forget that any of this had ever happened. The reason Susan had to die was so she could never testify in court about the corruption case. But sitting here now, the killer decided that for the person who had set this plot in motion, the real motive here was revenge. A moment later, the killer checked their watch and then reached over to the .45 caliber Ruger on the seat next to them. It was almost time. And sure enough, just after 8:30 p.m., the killer could see the doors of the church open, and in the light that spilled out, the killer had no trouble recognizing Susan's tall figure and white blonde curls. After exchanging goodbyes with other members of the choir, Susan stepped out from the group and started making her way across Martin Street toward the second parking lot. The killer stared at Susan in fascination. They had only been together 5 times, but the killer knew every inch of those long legs and feel of Susan's solid hips, back, chest, arms, and mouth. But aside from knowing Susan's body, the killer felt no connection to the woman they were about to kill. It wasn't like they had ever been in a relationship with one another. A minute later, and Susan had walked to the driver's side of her Jeep, opened the door, and tossed her purse onto the passenger seat. The killer lay back, still reclining, until Susan had climbed into the Jeep and started the engine. Then, sitting up, the killer leveled the gun at Susan and started pulling the trigger. The first shot shattered the window on the driver's side of the Jeep. That same bullet also passed directly through Susan's neck, hitting 2 major arteries. As Susan opened her door and tumbled out of the car, the killer shot 5 more rounds. 4 of those bullets would lodge into Susan's body. The 5th would lodge into the driver's side doorframe of her Jeep. 2 of the shots were fatal. Even as medics would later rush Susan to the hospital, she was already dying, and there was nothing anyone could have done to save her. As soon as the gun was empty, the killer shifted back into the driver's seat and took off out of the church parking lot. On their way home, the killer dropped off the garbage bag containing the gun, gloves, and ski mask at the prearranged location alongside of a nearby road. Then, Susan's sexual partner, a 50-year-old woman named Dawn Silvernail, stopped outside of a convenience store in Hyde Park, Poughkeepsie. Before heading back to her house and husband up in the Catskills, Dawn called her other sexual partner, Fred Andrus, on his pager. As soon as the device connected, Dawn carefully typed in the numbers 666, the agreed-upon code that would let Fred know that Susan Fassett, the 3rd member of their sexual threesome, and the woman who had dared to leave him, was now dead. It would turn out that it was Fred who had planned and orchestrated Susan's murder by coercing another one of his lovers to kill Susan. But it wasn't until mid-December that Fred revealed the name of the woman who had actually fired the shots that killed Susan. That was when an analysis of the DNA from Fred's drinking straw confirmed that Fred was the mystery man who had had sex with Susan within 2 days of her murder. By the time Jeff Fassett had confronted his wife back in mid-September with proof that he knew about her affair with Fred Andrus, Susan already knew that when it came to Fred, she was in way over her head. What had started as an affair 4 years earlier had become a relationship that Fred used to play out his own sexual fantasies. He made that easier for himself by getting Jeff Fassett moved to an overnight shift so Fred would have better access to Susan. In addition to Fred's relationship with Susan, he had also been involved with a woman named Dawn Silvernail. The two had first met back in 1977 over Citizens Band Radio, where Fred went by the name Neptune and Dawn went by the name Footloose. After meeting in person a year later, the two began a sexual relationship that would continue on and off for more than 20 years, during which time Fred would marry and divorce multiple times, and Dawn would marry and settle in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. Over the years, Fred had loaned Dawn about $15,000, which Dawn started paying back by performing sex acts for Fred, including having sex with Fred's friends and acquaintances. And by the summer of 1999, Fred had developed a taste for watching 2 women have sex with each other and then joining in to make it a threesome. It was then that Fred started recruiting and paying Dawn to have sex with Susan. The encounters would usually take place on the concrete floor of one of Poughkeepsie's several water pumping stations, except for the first encounter, which Fred staged in his own basement and which he videotaped from start to finish. After Susan ended her affair with Fred in mid-September, Susan's family believes that Fred, enraged by the rejection, may have threatened either to harm Susan's family or to reveal the contents of that sex tape unless she continued to see him. Once Fred was confronted in mid-December by investigators who now had proof that Fred had been lying to them all along about his involvement with Susan, Fred tried to save himself by pointing the finger at Dawn and insisting that Susan's death was the result of a lover's quarrel between the two women. But when interrogated by police, Dawn eventually laid out every detail of the murder plot devised by Fred Andrus, and handed over to police the gun she had used to kill Susan. And Dawn's story would be backed up by an analysis of phone and pager records belonging to Fred, Dawn, and Susan. The data showed that Dawn had called and talked with Fred several times on the day of Susan's murder, and that Dawn had paged Fred from the convenience store near his home shortly after she had committed the murder. According to Dawn, Fred had insisted that Susan had to die so she could never testify against him in court about his involvement in the Poughkeepsie corruption scandal, except that federal agents insisted that Susan had no involvement in that corruption probe and no information that could affect the case one way or another. But before police could arrest Fred, there would be one more unbelievable twist to this bizarre and tragic crime. On December 30th, 1999, 2 months after Susan's murder, police were inside the Andrus house executing a search warrant when they heard a single gunshot up in the attic. Realizing that he would be prosecuted for murder, Fred had attempted suicide by holding a gun to his chin and pulling the trigger. But instead of traveling up into his brain, the bullet glanced off the bone in Fred's jaw, and instead of killing him, it blew away the lower part of his face. Fred would survive the self-inflicted injury, and on February 23, 2001, he was found guilty of second-degree murder and conspiracy in the first degree in the death of Susan Fassett. The two charges would carry a combined prison sentence of 50 years to life. On March 16, 2001, Dawn Silvernail, who had accepted a guilty plea in exchange for testifying against Fred Andrus, was sentenced to 18 years to life for killing Susan Fassett. 1 year and 9 months into his prison sentence, at the age of 63, Fred Andrus died of an apparent heart attack at the Clinton Correctional Center in New York. Dawn Silvernail was released from prison after serving 16 years. She died 3 years later at the age of 70. Susan's husband, Jeff Fassett, remarried 5 years after Susan's death, and 2 years later retired from the Poughkeepsie Police Department. Jeff would die of cancer in 2018 at the age of 67. In April of 2020, a 17-year-old named Sam, who was an avid outdoorsman, decided to go on a one-night hike in the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. The mountain's name has a bunch of supposed origins, but the one that's generally accepted is people are afraid of the Superstition Mountains because of all the mysterious deaths that have occurred there. And so because people would avoid these mountains in fear of mysterious death, it became these Superstitious Mountains. But Sam was not superstitious and regularly came out here to go hiking, in particular on this 8-mile loop that went through a canyon. And so this one night overnight he planned on doing was going to be on that 8-mile loop where he'd do 4 miles in, camp out, and then 4 miles back. And he planned to do it with a friend, but his friend at the last minute canceled, and so Sam teetered on not even doing it, but ultimately decided, okay, I'll just do it by myself because I'm very familiar with this area. On the day he was supposed to go do this hike, he had planned on getting there early in the day to have maximum lighting, but due to some unforeseen circumstances and traffic and bad road conditions, he didn't get to the trailhead until 5:45 p.m. that night. Sam knew it was a bad idea to start this hike so late because he was going to run out of daylight. He probably was not going to make it 4 miles to the point where he planned on camping out. But he figured with his good health and fitness, he could probably quickly make his way to the 2 or even 3 mile mark, and there were some suitable campsites there. And so he decided he would kind of risk it and just try to go as fast as he could and use the daylight he had to reach a suitable campsite. But he wasn't able to move as fast as he thought he could, and soon the sun was down and it's totally dark, and he's got his flashlight, but that only is able to shine like 10 feet in front of him. And then at one point he nearly falls off of this rock, and he knows had he fallen, he would have gotten really badly hurt, and he's 15 miles away from the nearest help, and he's in a bad cell phone service area, and the roads getting out here are treacherous. No one knows exactly where he is, and it dawns on him that you've made a pretty bad choice, and you should stop right now and make camp here and not try to risk it any further. And so as it happened, where he was, there was this forest right nearby, and he could see there was a clearing about 30 feet off the path when he shined his light. And so he walked into that clearing, and he found it was a great spot to make camp. And in fact, on the edge of this clearing was the remnants of a fire pit. It was very old, but it at least showed someone had camped out right here, and they seemed to have made it just fine. So suddenly he was feeling pretty smart, and he felt pretty good about where he was staying for the night. Now, Sam intentionally did not bring a tent. He liked to sleep on a sleeping pad with a sleeping bag over that, and then he would string up a tarp over the top of him in case it rained. And since this clearing was surrounded by a bunch of pine trees, he was able to string up his tarp over the top, and it was perfect. And pretty soon he had a fire going, and then he cracked open a can of beans and he began eating his dinner. And as he was eating, he started to get a sense that something was off, something was not right. He began scanning the tree line as if he was going to find something out of the ordinary, but his visibility was incredibly limited because he was sitting right up against a fire. And if you've ever sat next to a fire in a dark forest, your visibility is like 5 feet in a circle around the fire. You really cannot see beyond that. And his vision was also limited by all the pine trees that encircled his clearing. So he really could only see what was immediately around him, nothing else. And he starts thinking, that's got to be it. Maybe I'm just nervous because I have no visibility. But as he's rationalizing this kind of bad gut feeling, a rock the size of a marble comes soaring into the campsite and lands at his feet. And he looks down at the rock, and immediately he connects that to that sense of dread he had. And he's looking around a little more aggressively now, but again, his vision is very, very limited. And so for the next 15 minutes, Sam is really aggressively scanning the tree line and listening really intently, and he doesn't hear anything, he doesn't see any more rocks get thrown. And so he begins to rationalize and convince himself that there's nothing wrong here. That feeling I have, oh, don't worry about that. He starts telling himself, I must have kicked a rock, that's what it is. Or maybe a rock fell off a tree. But either way, it's something totally explainable and you got nothing to worry about. And after a little while, he convinced himself and he got into his sleeping bag under his tarp and he went to sleep. A couple of hours later, Sam wakes up and he has that same sense of dread, and now it's back with a vengeance. And he can't hear anything, he can't see anything, but he's definitely feeling like something is wrong. And at that moment, as he's listening really intently and looking really carefully, he hears the sound of rustling leaves. It sounds like someone walking through leaves about 30 or 40 meters away from his campsite. And initially, he can't tell if this person or animal is walking towards his campsite or away, but over the next 30 seconds or so, the sounds start to fade, and he convinces himself that, okay, they've left and everything's fine. But just in case, he wanted to grab his flashlight and shine it in that direction, and so he reaches next to him where he had left it when he had gone to bed a couple hours earlier, and he can't find his flashlight. And he's looking around for it, and he can't find it, and he's like, man, that's weird, I had it right here, right next to my body, and it's not here anymore. And that's when the alarm bells start going off in his head, because the only way this flashlight moves is if he moved it. And if it's not here, how did it move? And so he jumps out of his sleeping bag, he ducks out from under the tarp, and he's looking around on the ground in the immediate vicinity of where he was sleeping to find this flashlight. And as he's looking, out of the corner of his eye, he sees some light. And he turns his head, and in the same direction that he had heard those footsteps, those rustling leaves, when he was still laying down, he sees his flashlight laying on the ground about 10 meters away. Which means someone or something had been less than a foot away from him to get this flashlight that was right next to him while he was fast asleep and totally helpless, and had moved it all the way over there. And immediately, Sam thinks to himself, that's a trap. They are trying to lure me away from my campsite. Suddenly, he felt so scared he wanted to vomit, but he knew in order to survive this situation, he needed to keep his wits about him. So he puts his boots on and he grabs his knife, and he knows he's not leaving this campsite. In fact, he's going to build the biggest fire he can. He's going to stoke that fire as big as he can get it, and he's not going to go anywhere near that flashlight. For the next several hours, Sam just stood in the middle of his campsite holding his knife, preparing to confront whatever the heck is out in the woods. And over those several hours, he would hear footsteps approach his campsite, turn around, and leave. Every time the fire got lower, he noticed they would come closer and closer and closer, and when he would stoke the fire, they wouldn't come as close. But at about 3 a.m., he ran out of firewood, so unless he went into the woods to get more, he'd be out, and he's certainly not going into the woods. That's the whole point, is to avoid the woods where this thing is. And so as the fire died down, Sam prepared himself mentally for whatever happened next, because he knew that with that fire gone, this thing was comfortable coming all the way in, coming all the way up right next to him to get the flashlight. And so finally, he hears the footsteps approaching, and before this, the closest they had come was maybe about 15 meters away. They were far enough away it didn't feel intimate. It was terrifying, but he had some distance. This time, they walk right up to about 3 meters away, but they intentionally come behind the thickest group of trees, so he can't see them, and it's still dark outside, and he's in that bubble of light near the fire, so he's blind to whatever's on the other side of those trees, but he knows they're there, and they've stopped. And for 2 hours, this poor kid is standing in the middle of this campsite, facing in the direction of whatever is behind the trees. Probably his imagination is going crazy at this point with what could be behind those trees, just waiting for whatever happened next. But ultimately, the only thing that would happen is the sun would eventually come up, and right before it actually popped over the horizon, this thing on the other side finally moved, it turned around and ran away, and it did not come back. And so when the sun finally did come up, Sam didn't just charge out of there because he's still thinking there could be a trap. He waited until it was totally full sunlight, and then he packed up everything he had, and he practically sprinted back to the parking lot, back into his car, and he drove nonstop for 20 miles until he got to a gas station where he could park and collect himself. And when he got there, he got out of his car and he went in and he got a drink, and when he came out, he noticed someone had written something on the dust on the back window of his car. And he walks over and it just says, "Sleep well?" ? Sam is confident whoever was stalking him at his campsite is the same person or group of people that wrote this message on his car. And now Sam just wonders, what would have happened if I retrieved that flashlight? Our next story is called It Started with a Whistle. In 2017, 27-year-old Lydia Makarchuk left her home country of Ukraine and moved to Bracknell, which is a town just outside of London. Shortly after moving into her new apartment, Lydia went out and got a job as an accountant at a local hotel, and then after that, Lydia pretty much swore off her social life and instead just focused exclusively on working hard and saving money. The one reprieve she got from work was going to church on Sundays. 2 years later, Lydia was at her church enjoying the coffee hour that always followed the Sunday sermon when another member of her church, who she didn't really speak to, this 41-year-old man named Norbert Varga, approached her and kind of awkwardly complimented her shoes. And she was so flattered by this that it opened up a friendly conversation between the two of them. And during this conversation, Lydia was pleasantly surprised to find out that Norbert was an expat too. An expat is someone who lives outside of their native country. Norbert had moved to the UK in 2018, so that's 1 year after Lydia had moved to the UK, and he came from Hungary, which shares a border with Ukraine. And just like Lydia, when he got to the UK, he kind of put all his energy into his work and trying to save money. He was a radio technician and a photographer. And so the two spend the rest of this coffee hour chatting and enjoying each other's company. And then afterwards, when they left the church and they both got home, they both found themselves thinking about the other. There was clearly an attraction there. And so the following Sunday, they both very eagerly rushed back to church in order to spend more time together. And sure enough, during that coffee hour, they spent the whole time together just chatting it up. And then afterwards, they exchanged phone numbers and made plans to get together outside of church. They were going to go on a date. And so the rest, as they say, is history. 2 years after Norbert complimented Lydia's shoes, they got married in Bracknell. And while the wedding was great, unfortunately, none of Lydia's family members, who were all in Ukraine, none of them could attend the actual wedding. And so the newlywed couple decided the way they would handle that is their honeymoon would be spent in Ukraine. That way Lydia's family could celebrate their wedding as well. For a variety of reasons, this honeymoon trip to Ukraine kept getting pushed back, but finally in September of 2021, everything lined up, everyone was available, and so Norbert and Lydia rushed to the airport and they hopped on a flight. And during this flight to Ukraine, Lydia remembers being so excited specifically about her husband finally getting a chance to spend some time with her 29-year-old younger brother Miroslav. Lydia was very close with her brother, and so it mattered to her greatly that he and her husband had a good relationship. But to that point, because of the great physical distance between the UK and Ukraine, the two had really not had that much interaction, and so they really didn't know each other very well. And so this trip was really important to Lydia, and Miroslav, he really picked up on that because he put together this camping trip for the end of their stay in Ukraine, where he knew he'd be able to step aside with Norbert and chat with him and get to know him a little bit. And so that was kind of like the fail-safe, where if he and Norbert did not get a chance to speak all week because they were visiting with so many people, they would have a chance to at the end of the week on this camping trip. So after a few hours of flying, Lydia and Norbert touch down in Ukraine, and they make their way to Lydia's family's house where they're going to be staying for the week. And that night, and for the next several days, the couple was swamped with several family reunions and meetups with old friends that hadn't seen Lydia in years. And so Norbert and Miroslav were not getting any time to themselves, and Lydia really knew that. And so she and Norbert began looking forward to this camping trip because that not only represented a kind of peaceful break from the chaos of all these reunions, but it also did represent the one chance they knew Miroslav and Norbert would get to interact with each other. And so finally, September 15th, the end of the week, it came, and it was time to go on this camping trip. And so Lydia and Norbert and Miroslav and 9 other family members, they all packed up their tents and their camping belongings, and they loaded up a couple of cars, and they drove over to the base of the Carpathian mountain range. This mountain range, which stretches for nearly 1,000 miles across Eastern and Central Europe, are very popular amongst tourists because it's stunningly beautiful. Everything is green and lush, and there are these crystal clear lakes and breathtaking waterfalls and all these amazing animals running around, and there's no mosquitoes, and they have these really cool hikes that bring you up to these very impressive overlooks. And so that night, Miroslav had made reservations for this one campsite, this very popular campsite that was up in this clearing, not too far up the mountain, and it had this great view down to the forest below, and because it was in a clearing, it had this unobstructed view up to the sky, where in this area, you could look up and just see stars in every direction. And so when Lydia and the rest of this group arrived in the parking lot of this mountain range, they were all really excited to get up to this campsite and just enjoy being there. And so they park their cars, they get their gear out, they find the trailhead, and then they begin hiking up the mountain. And about 2 hours later, they arrive at this clearing. They find their campsite, which was marked by this small fire pit underneath a couple of trees. And so they go over and they set their tents up, and some people go out and get some firewood. And then before long, a fire was made, and this group of 12 people that had not seen each other in so long, they just sat down and began enjoying each other's company. They put tea on, they were swapping stories. It was really just this wonderful time. And then around 8 p.m., the sun started to set, at which point this huge group just stopped and enjoyed this beautiful sunset. And then once the sun had gone down, there were 2 kids that were there on this trip. And so they were put to bed in their tent. And then the remaining 10 adults just kind of hung out by the fire and enjoyed each other's company. And it was actually during this second half of the night that Norbert and Miroslav finally really got a chance to just chat with each other. So for about an hour, they were talking to each other, and Lydia is just watching this happen, and she couldn't be happier. This is like the perfect ending to this trip. And then around 9 p.m., Norbert stands up. Lydia sees him stand up, and he tells the group he's going to run back to his tent, which was a ways away from the campfire, and he was going to get his camera. And so Lydia said, okay, no problem. And she remembers watching him walk off into the distance, because when you're at the campfire, if you're looking away from the campfire, everything is pitch black in that direction. And so she watches him disappear into the darkness, and then she and her brother and everyone else just kind of turn back towards the campfire. And then all she remembers about what happens next is she heard a whistling sound. And at first, it was very faint. But it started to get very, very loud, and when it got loud, she tried to kind of figure out where it was, but before she could, suddenly something hit her in the face, predominantly hit her in the nose. And as soon as it did, she went blind, she went deaf, and then she felt herself on the ground, and she has no idea what's going on, and all she can remember thinking is, oh my God, something horrible has happened to me. I might die. I don't know what's happening, but I might die. And so she started praying for herself to survive whatever was happening to her. And then her hearing started to come back just a little bit. Her vision was still totally blurred. She could only kind of tell where the fire was because it was bright. But her hearing, it started to come back. And that's when she heard moaning coming from somewhere near her. And so she's thinking, okay, whatever horrible thing has happened to me has happened to other people too. And so instead of just praying for herself, she began praying for everyone who was at this campsite. And so as her hearing is getting louder and louder and she's hearing more and more moaning and crying happening all around her, she suddenly hears her husband screaming her name. Her vision is still gone, but she knows it's him, and he lands right behind her and he grabs her and he's just repeating her name over and over and over again. And then Lydia manages to kind of choke out to her husband what happened. And there's a pause, and then Norbert says to her, "It's bad. It's really bad." It would turn out their campsite was on a battlefield from World War I, and buried underneath the soil right under their fire pit was an unexploded bomb from World War I. Meaning, for over 100 years, countless campers have arrived at this campsite and lit fires on top of this bomb that they couldn't see. And each fire gradually eroded the outer metal casing of this explosive until finally that night in September, with Lydia and 11 of her loved ones nearby, their little fire finally was it. It pushed through that last little bit of the casing and it ignited the bomb and it detonated. That whistling that she heard was the sound of the fire finally cutting through that casing and being exposed to the fire. And then that thing that struck her in the face, that hit her right on the nose, that was almost certainly a piece of the bomb itself, so shrapnel that was cutting through her face. And then the moaning she heard was primarily her brother, who was right next to her. Lydia would be gravely wounded, but she would survive. As for her brother and another man who was not named, they would not survive. The next and final story of today's episode is called Thorns. In 2012, a 22-year-old woman named Simone was living in a small winemaking village called Rüdesheim am Rhein, which is located in southwestern Germany. This village is strikingly beautiful. It's full of quaint European homes, and there's lots of rolling green hills with vineyards as far as the eye can see, and the village sits right on the banks of the Rhine River. Simone had grown up in this picturesque village, and she had loved it, but this was going to be her last summer before she left and headed off to New York City to start the next chapter of her life. And while she was excited about that, she was also kind of sad because this village and everybody inside of it were the only things she had ever known. And so the idea of leaving them behind just seemed very strange to her. But instead of focusing on the kind of growing anxiety around her imminent departure from Germany, she focused on what she would be doing that summer while she was still in Germany. Some of Simone's fondest memories of her childhood were of her time spent at summer camp. And the summer camp was located in this forest that was not far from her village. And every summer in July, Simone, along with about 200 other kids from her village and from neighboring villages, would converge on the campgrounds in the forest for 2 weeks of playing games and going on scavenger hunts and putting on stage plays and just generally having a really good time. But when Simone became a teenager and was too old to be a camp attendee, she decided she would volunteer and be a camp counselor. And she found it was awesome. She immediately connected with the other camp counselors, and she felt all grown up, having a real job, and she loved goofing around with all of the kids. And so every summer since that first time volunteering, Simone had gone back and volunteered again. And this summer was no different. So, in mid-July of that year, Simone packed up her things and she headed off to the forest. The way this camp worked was the 200-plus kids that were attending the camp, they would get dropped off in the mornings each day by their parents, and they'd play and run around all day, and then in the late afternoon, their parents would come back and pick them up. So none of the kids were sleeping over at the camp during these 2 weeks. However, the 30-plus counselors, they would just stay at the camp for the full 2 weeks. They would just sleep in tents out in the forest. Technically, the reason they did this was to make sure they had enough time in the morning to prep the campgrounds for the kids, and then also in the evenings to have enough time to clean up and kind of have it ready for the next day. But in reality, Simone and the other counselors all knew that the camping out in the forest was the best part of the volunteer experience. After all the kids went home for the night, all of the counselors would finish up all of their duties and then rush off into the forest where their tents were and where there was a fire pit, and they would have some beers and wine because the legal drinking age in Germany is actually 16. So all these counselors are having a couple of drinks, and then before long they'd be laughing and telling stories and just generally having a great time. So that July in 2012, Simone and the other counselors arrived at the campgrounds a day early, and they caught up with each other and they prepared the campground. And then the next morning, all the kids showed up and everything went off without a hitch. And then that afternoon, after all the kids had been picked up by their parents, Simone and the other counselors rushed to finish up all their duties and then headed off into the woods to enjoy their first night hanging out together. After a couple of beers had been passed around the campfire, everybody was in good spirits and laughing and telling stories. But pretty quickly, people started to fade and get tired because, it was their first day back at camp and it had been a long, tiring day. And so people very gradually began retiring to their tents to go to bed. And eventually Simone, too, had crawled into her tent and gotten onto her cot to try to sleep herself. But she found that night it was so hot she couldn't be in her tent. It was stifling inside of there. And so she decides she's just going to sleep out in the open where it's a little bit cooler. And so she picks up her fold-up cot and she brings it out into the open, and she sees there are several other counselors who have done the same thing. And so she puts her cot down next to one of her good friends who's already asleep in her cot. And then Simone climbs into her cot, she gets under her covers, and she tries to fall asleep. But for the next hour, Simone just tosses and turns, she can't get comfortable, and by that time, everybody else has completely passed out. So it's just her, she's counting down the time until she has to get up again to start the next day, and so she's getting stressed about that. But eventually, she would fall asleep. However, she would immediately be thrust into one of the most visceral and intense nightmares she had ever had in her entire life. In her dream, she opens her eyes and she looks out in front of her, and it's this desert city, and there are hundreds of people all in front of her, just standing there looking up at her. And then she notices on her left and on her right are these two men, these big, huge men that are both working on something behind her. She doesn't really know what it is, but they're obviously busy doing something. And she kind of glances up at one of them and she notices he's holding something that looks like a wreath, like a holiday wreath you would hang on your door. And so Simone looks away from the guy with the wreath and just looks back out at this huge sea of people, which is totally bizarre because no one's moving, no one's making any sound, they're just staring at her. And then she feels this shooting pain in the top of her head. The man who was standing on her right was not holding a holiday wreath. He was holding a crown of thorns, and now he, along with the guy on the other side of her, were working together to press this crown of thorns into her head. And so Simone is feeling the thorns being pressed deeper and deeper into her scalp, and she tries to fight them off, but she realizes she can't move. She can't even turn her head to look at them. She can only see them out of her periphery vision. And then she tries to scream out for help to someone in the crowd to come help her, but when she opens her mouth, no sound comes out. And so as she's sitting there, all she can do is stare straight out ahead of her as the pressure of these thorns are driven deeper and deeper into her skin. And then at some point, blood begins dripping down in front of her eyes. And around that point, the pain became so blinding, so awful that it woke her up. And as soon as she woke up, she shot up and she reached for her head to make sure there was no crown of thorns on her. And as she's doing that, she's thinking, okay, phew, it was just a dream. That was just a horrible dream. I'm in this forest. I'm good. I'm safe. And as she's kind of patting on her head, she's realizing her head is wet. And as she's touching her head, she's realizing it hurts. There's a stinging pain in her head. And then she realizes it's not just a stinging pain, it's a throbbing, intense pain all over her head. And so as she's kind of having this realization that her dream is now kind of segued into her real life, she looks out ahead of her and she sees off in the distance in the tree line, something is running through the woods. She can't tell who or what it is, but she makes a mental note that there is someone running away from them. But this pain in her head has gotten so intense that she can't focus on anything else. She can only focus on the pain. And as she's thinking about how much her head hurts, she screams in pain. And the girl who was laying next to her that had been asleep, she wakes up to the sound of the scream, but it's totally pitch black. She has no idea what's going on with Simone. And so this girl, she sits up and she's trying to get Simone to tell her what's going on, but Simone has no idea. She's totally frantic. She can't really make sense of what's happening. And so this friend, she reaches down and she picks up a flashlight, she turns it on, and she aims the light at Simone, illuminating her head. And when this friend sees Simone's head, she starts to scream. Seconds later, the rest of the counselors that had been sleeping out were awake, and they were rushing Simone, who was now shaking and vomiting, over to one of the staff vans. And then 15 minutes later, they had driven her to the emergency room. It would turn out, after Simone had finally fallen asleep and she began having that really intense dream about a crown of thorns being dug into her scalp, well, in reality, something was digging into her scalp, and it was kind of manifesting itself in her dream. And what was digging into her scalp was the jaws of a fox. This fox had snuck into the campsite and walked right up behind Simone and just started eating her head. And amazingly, it did not wake Simone up right away. And so this fox got 20 or so serious bites out of Simone's head before she shot up and scared it away. And so almost certainly what Simone saw running away from her in that quick moment was the fox. Doctors were able to save Simone and stitch her head back together, and they were even able to hide all of the scars in her hairline so you can't even see them. But despite her being physically okay today, psychologically, this was a very traumatizing event. Not only does she refuse now to go into any forest, whether it's day or night, but she also periodically still gets phantom pains in her scalp that feels like the fox is biting her head all over again.